Up there's the noon bell in Manchester ringing.
There you go. All right. Well, thank you everyone for joining us today. I want to welcome you to the Office of Planning and Development's May Planning Lunches at Noon webinar titled Making Zoning Work for Housing in Your Community. My name is Noah Hodgetts, and I'm a principal planner at the Office of Planning and Development at the New Hampshire Department of Business and Economic Affairs, BEA. I'm joined by Sylvia Von Aulich, Executive Director of the Southern New Hampshire Planning Commission, and Stephen Buckley, the Legal Services Counsel at the New Hampshire Municipal Association. Today's webinar comes after we have recently learned from the release of the New Hampshire Housing Statewide Housing Needs Assessment that there's a shortage of over 23,500 housing units statewide and a need for almost 60,000 new housing units by 2030. Today's webinar will provide an overview of different tools and strategies to communities, especially community planners and land use boards interested in addressing the housing challenge at the local level, with a specific emphasis on zoning and land use regulation changes which can incentivize housing production at the local level. To ask a question, you can type your questions in the chat box. We'll do our best to try to answer questions at the end of each of our three speakers' presentations. There'll also be time for additional Q&A at the end of all three presentations. Today's webinar is also being recorded and will be available for viewing afterwards on OPD's YouTube channel. So without further ado, first we'll hear from Sylvia Von Aulich and Stephen Buckley, who will provide some specific strategies and recommendations, mostly zoning related, that communities can consider to incentivize and increase housing production. Then I'll talk about some different tools and resources available to communities interested in implementing these strategies and recommendations, as well as where to find additional information about strategies not covered today. Finally, we'll have some time at the end for additional Q&A. So without further ado, I'm going to turn it over to Sylvia. And before I do, I'm going to launch a poll question that Sylvia asked about how many of you have been involved with the Regional Planning Commission's Regional Housing Needs Assessment process. We'll see if this works.
I do see the poll come up.
Great.
I'm reluctant to answer because I don't want to be the only one that says yes.
So we are getting some answers. I'll leave it over with about 19 responses. So I'll give it another 30 seconds or so before we close it.
Yeah, and the reason why I'm curious about this, Noah, and to all our participants is, unlike when we're all together in the same room, we can gauge our audience and sort of have a better understanding on who we're talking with. And today I have no idea. So I would love to hear from you if you had any involvement, if you had any knowledge of the Regional Housing Needs Assessment, and maybe in your own community or you are aware of other regional planning commissions. So let us know. And it's okay to say no. I'm just curious.
Great. So we have about 28 responses. I'm sure there'll be more trickling in. About 29% say yes, they were involved with the process, and 71% say they were not involved with the process.
Right. And I just see a quick chat that one individual said here, yes, knowledge, but no involvement. So I can appreciate that too. All right. Are we ready for me to move on?
Please.
So thanks everybody for coming today. So whether or not you were aware of the Regional Housing Needs Assessment or not, just a little backdrop. There are 9 regional planning commissions in the state. I am with Southern New Hampshire Planning Commission, and that's in the Manchester region. And we have an extremely diverse set of communities. Obviously, the largest one outside of Boston, where Manchester is the largest town outside of Boston in all of New England, at 115,000 and counting. But we also have very small communities in our region, under 4,000 and even under 2,000 people. So really a broad range of types of communities. But what I want to talk to you about today is what we heard from our communities, what we know, and what's next. And it's not going to be, let's see, I'm getting used to my mouse. There we go. So what we heard, there was a considerable amount of outreach from all the different regional planning commissions throughout this process. And that outreach started in January of last year in 2022. There were surveys for the general public. There were surveys for employers, surveys and discussion groups with developers and also with social service professionals. So we were trying as a coordinated effort with all the regional planning commissions to get a broad spectrum of input about housing and housing needs. And here's what we heard. So from the general public, from residents in all the different communities in our region, so that's 14 communities again in the Manchester region, we heard, hey, please let's get housing that is low maintenance. We want it to be low impact. We want smaller homes. And we want, and every single town, no matter what the size, if it's rural, if it's urban, or something in between, they want to keep their community character. That's why they moved to their community. And so we heard that a lot. And also, aside from low impact, we want to keep the costs down. I don't think anyone is ever out there on a picket line to scream, raise my taxes. Nobody's doing that, right? So keeping costs low. From employers, we heard loud and clear, thriving businesses need staffing and staffing needs housing. There's a lot of housing shortages, and that equates to labor shortages. We need more options near employment centers. From developers, this should be no surprise. What we heard was we need more flexibility in regulations. We really need a shorter, clearer process with fewer hoops. And instead of the NIMBY effect, the not in my backyard effect, we need the yes in my backyard effect. We can't always just have the folks who are against a project come out. We need folks who are for a project to come out. And from social service professionals, really more choices for low income and vulnerable populations. One of the questions that we heard, or what we asked from residents in our region, when thinking about housing in your community, please indicate your level of agreement with the need for additional units for each stated housing type. So let's take a look. There's 3 here: high-end housing, moderate income, and low-income housing. Even if you can't read the fine print here, if it's pink or red, they're like, no, we don't need this. If it's light green or green, we're like, yes, or we need it really badly. And yellow is that neutral. So you can see on the high end, about 2/3 said, nope, we don't need a lot more high-end housing. On the other hand, moderate income, more than 2/3 said, yep, that looks sort of like that 4/5 kind of fraction said, yep, we really need moderate income. And then it looks like 2/3 said yes to low income housing. And that might surprise people because often when push comes to shove and it's in front of a planning board, they're saying no. So let's get to that too. But first, let's talk about New Hampshire businesses and how they have been affected by the lack of housing. So businesses said 62% of the respondents believe that a housing supply shortage impacts their ability to attract, keep, and even afford workers. 65% of respondents described the availability of housing options in or near the area where their businesses is located as very limited. And the majority of respondents said that their employees generally do not live in the same town as they work. Why is that a problem? Because everything costs so much anymore. Just the price of gas and the price of a car, the price of insurance. So everything adds up to just general costs and well-being. So if an employee has to live 5 towns away to afford that housing, one, it affects their commute time and how they get there and the expense of how they get there. So they're going to ask the employer to pay for some of those things. Some of the direct quotes we got, and I wrote these down. People cannot afford to work for a nonprofit like mine if they have any childcare or debt expenses with rent and home ownership costing what it does. So we heard a lot about just the cost of rent and mortgage, but also housing is so far and few between that the costs are outrageous and make it difficult to afford housing, especially if they're having to travel distance. So what do we do about it? Let's talk about next steps and what you, if you're representing a community, what you might do. So let's talk about some low-hanging fruit and beginning with community goals in mind. So, for example, updating your community's master plan and ensuring community engagement and input guides master plan goals. Conducting regulation assessments to identify roadblocks or unfair costs. When I talk about regulation assessments, I'm talking about site and subdivision regulations as well as zoning. And then ensuring the community's master plan is in sync with all of that, all those regulations, whether it's zoning, site, and subdivision regulations, because you may not, your timing of updating those 2 or 3 different entities, if I call it entities, they often aren't matching. You're not doing it all at the same time. So making sure they do match. So let's talk about, I want to spend a moment on this. So let's talk about master planning update. So one, are you aware of your community's master plan and when was the last time it was updated? If it was longer than 8 to 10 years, it needs to be updated for sure. And making sure the community engagement is there is because you want the people who live in your town now to get involved and help you guide those updates. And I'm not just talking about the housing chapter. I'm talking about the transportation chapter, community services, recreation and engagement, because all those have relationships to housing. Number 2, the regulation assessment. One thing you can do to make sure the cost of doing something like that is not unattainable is that you involve a subcommittee of planning board, zoning board, historic district commission, conservation commission, and get those land use board volunteers to tackle one element at a time. Who might help you with these things? Regional planning commissions. So we're here to help. And that, so as I mentioned, there are 9 of us, and so we can certainly help with that kind of thing. And the other thing is, where might you get funding for this? Well, presently there are those HOP grants out there, and that can certainly help make this all happen. So lots of low-hanging fruit. Let's talk about flexibility in regulations. So my comic here on one size fits all And we know it's not true. And we know that there are a lot of one size fit all kind of regulations out there. Front yard setback, side yard, backyard setbacks, uh, how many acres any given lot needs to be. So how do you create flexibility in zoning? And one part is utilizing the conditional use permit method for case by case considerations. That it maybe you already have something like that built into your zoning, and you're not utilizing it often enough. But what it does is it allows the planning board to weigh in on any particular case. And yeah, there's a whole process for that. And certainly, again, regional planning commissions or your own community can walk you through how that works. Another way for creating flexibility is that the planning and zoning boards support reuse and redevelopment for existing abandoned structures. In your mind's eye, consider your own community. And I bet there are buildings that have been abandoned. A business has no longer, and it's empty, and it has laid empty for decades. Why not support the reuse and redevelopment? It may not be zoned in a housing zone. It may be in a commercial district. So why not create some flexibility there to allow some sort of housing to make use of those buildings? And then lastly, infill lots allow setbacks that match abutters. This gets a little bit into those weeds for zoning, but if you picture whether it's a downtown, typically this would be downtown. What if okay, so someone's going to have to tell me about these questions later. Oh my gosh, I messed up. Sorry. Um, so let's talk about the infill and what that means specifically. What that's talking about is you have usually an in-town lot, you have a building, empty lot, building. And if you went strictly by zoning, that empty lot would be restricted to a front yard setback, side yard, and backyard setbacks that didn't equate at all to what is existing on the ground next door. So this is an allowance to match the same setbacks that those neighboring properties have. Very simple. And let's feel free to put in your questions into the chat and I'll tackle at the end. All right, another low-hanging fruit, supporting community businesses. That first picture there, help wanted. I wish I could see all your hands raised for this, but I bet you every single person on this webinar today can imagine the help wanted sign in their own community or in a community on your way home where a restaurant that you like to stop at, this has nothing to do with me at all now, and trying to go to my own restaurants on my way home, especially on a Friday. And all of a sudden they aren't open anymore because they can't get help. So like I mentioned earlier, why not allow and encourage employer housing to promote employment and housing opportunities? How do we do that? Let's rethink commercial office and industrial zones to allow multifamily behind business establishments. The second picture here, and this is exactly, so I was the town planner in Exeter for 16 years. And what we did, this is Route 27 heading into Exeter. And what we did, the whole front along 27, that's a commercial zone. And what we did was we worked with property owners to allow multifamily behind. A lot of these lots were narrow in the front and they would get bigger in the back. So we said, keep your commercial in the front, but let's build multifamily to the back of the property. And that's what has happened. Very successful. Consider the needs of the community. As I mentioned earlier in our survey work, and also, when you all work with engagement for your updating your master plans, listen to what the community wants and what they need. And what we heard was we need to encourage walkable and accessible village neighborhoods that are low maintenance, and small is the new big. Back in 2000 to probably 2010, it was all about the McMansions out there. But we have heard over and over our own adult children can't afford them. And for the folks that are elderly and now they want to downsize, they don't know what to do with them, and there's no alternative housing in their community. So why not listen to that and provide zoning allowances to have walkable, accessible, village-style neighborhoods? The other second bullet here, incentivize or require a percentage of homes that follow universal design guidelines to ensure accessibility to people of all ages and abilities. So we know that New Hampshire is an aging state. Depending on the community, the percentage varies, but we're aging, and we usually fight for either second or third place in the country for the oldest state in the nation. So we need to make sure the homes that are built are accessible to our own residents, to the people who are already here. And that's what Universal Design Guidelines does. It makes sure that it's accessible if you need a walker or a wheelchair. So there's first floor, main bedroom and bath. The hallways are wide enough to allow for a wheelchair or a walker, that kind of thing. That's what we're talking about here. DIY and housing. So I'm always very, very happy about talking about do-it-yourselfers. I usually have more than a dozen projects going on in my own home, but let's take it to a new level. The real DIYers are those who want to create accessory dwelling units in their own homes. So a second, smaller accessory dwelling unit. They've sometimes been called in-law apartments, that kind of thing. And the outside, typically looks exactly the same. You wouldn't know that more than one family lives there, but you have available parking for a second individual or small family. It's usually one person. If it's two, it's be amazing. But anyway, and often an ADU is, for example, if you're an older person and you want your adult children to move back home to keep an eye on you, to help you around your the house that you raised them in, you can create an accessory dwelling unit that is separate from you, in whether it's attached. Some communities allow for detached, but it does allow for those family kind of situations where, whether it's the older adults bringing in their young family back, or it's a young family bringing their older parent back into the house, that's what it allows for. And basically it doubles the density, and it's a win-win for aging in place and aging in your community. Conversions of larger single-family homes into multi-units without changing the footprint, another, to me, low-hanging fruit. We heard so often, we want the community to have the same look. These are all allowances for creating more density, but keeping the same look to the community. And the third bullet here, allowance for tiny homes and tiny home harbors. So I've sort of loved this tiny home harbors. I came up with that. But what most people think of this, really, it's sort of that cottage style neighborhood. And basically it's saying, look, for communities who are interested in allowing smaller homes on a piece of property, let's find a way to make that happen. And this is one angle. More low-hanging fruit that involves density. A lot of folks are nervous about density, but it is not a four-letter word. When I have worked with developers, I actually was never worried about density at all I was more interested in working with the developer on ensuring great buffers and making sure access was there, sidewalks, and also amenities so that the neighborhood we were creating wouldn't impact surrounding existing homes and homeowners. So I was never worried about the density, just about the buffers and existing amenities on the new proposed development. But here, the two bullets that I'm looking at now are allowing science and innovation to determine necessary water and wastewater infrastructure. And doing that, consider soil-based density equation to ensure the land is capable of the development. So what I'm really getting at here is instead of making sure every lot is 2 acres or 5 acres, or in some communities, even 10 acres, believe it or not, what I want to make sure is um, can the soil, is it capable of handling the water and sewer needs of that particular development? And let the science determine the density. More low-hanging fruit, communicate the type of growth wanted. So really, in this case, for our land use volunteers out there, hey, work together and create a visual guide for developers to ensure growth is in line with community desires. How do you do that? How do you know what type of growth you need? Well, research what other communities in New Hampshire are doing. What kind of development has happened in your own town that you like? So create what we call a lookbook, and invite the community to provide input on that, whether it's getting into the weeds of what type of buildings, the building details, but the type of details that honors the community character. And then you have a product that you can show a developer to say, this is the kind of development we want. And I think that must have been my last slide. And so we're gonna, Steve, you take it away now.
Thank you, Sylvia. Just give me a moment as I get my settings set.
While Steve is getting set, Noah, did you want me to address questions now, or are we going to do them at the end?
Sure, we can take a minute to get through a couple of the questions right now. Some of them were specific to your presentation. Let me just scroll back up here. I think we got the first one was, what if the owner of the abandoned structure won't work with the town to put in housing?
Well, yeah, you have to have the owner of the abandoned structure work with you, right? That's fundamental. So usually it's the owner of the abandoned structure has already worked with a developer. And so there's going to be a purchase and sales agreement there. So that's as simple as that. Because a town isn't going to want to buy the property. The towns aren't typically doing that kind of work. So it's working with a developer and the owner and making it worthwhile, I suppose.
And I might add, and Steve, feel free to add anything here too. There's not a whole lot the town can do if the property owner is current on their taxes. If they're back taxes and there's actually a tax lien on their property, there may be other options for kind of, taking back that property and doing something about that. So those are kind of two different situations. The other thing I'll talk a little bit about in my section about kind of resources in the Invest in Age demolition program that'll aid with paying for demolition of abandoned structures to create housing.
The next question was, what will incentivize developers to provide moderate income housing if they can sell for market rate? Yeah, so in that way, it's usually a density bonus that will provide for like that workforce or affordable housing. And so that's usually a lot of work around that. Adding an ADU is like building a second home. I can't recommend that it's done as DIY. True, it's right. Yes, it's always good to hire a professional builder. I've only seen a couple of examples. What will insulin provide? I'm not sure what that whole thing says. Additional density is the most common incentive. Yes, it is.
The one thing I would add that in this area of trying to create affordable housing, whether it's moderate or for workforce housing, the municipality certainly, as part of the approval process, can require that there be some assurances of continued affordability, which can allow you to attach covenants and conditions that require that there's a set price point for the housing, and that there is a limited period of time, as much as perhaps 5 years, that the person who owns the property can only recover a certain amount of the increased value over a period of time. So you're trying to ensure through the approval process that there is kind of assurances of continued affordability, because you don't want to see that income, that the value of the property increase so rapidly they get flipped and sold and no longer affordable. So those are just some things that could be employed as strategies to maintain affordable housing.
Thank you, Steve.
So I think I'll take it away then.
Just one more comment on the ADU.
Okay.
So I'm not necessarily saying that folks who are interested in doing an ADU do all the work themselves. I think that was taken a little bit too literally. What meaning is that to solve your own solution on creating, especially for older adults who have lived in their community for 20, 40 years, and they don't want to leave it, they can solve their own issue of creating affordable housing for themselves by creating an ADU in their own property. And so that is solving their own problem. Now take it away, Steve.
Well, in answer to Alexis's question about assurances of continued affordability, I can actually tell you a personal story. My brother, back in the 1980s, was trying to get into the housing market, a very expensive housing market in Santa Barbara, and his wife was a teacher. And Santa Barbara created a separate housing development just for teachers, firefighters, and policemen. When they bought in, the property was subject to a covenant so that the amount that they could resell the property over a period of 5 years would have a recapture of prices or value that would be required to be paid back to an affordable housing nonprofit. If they sold it in the first year, they'd have to pay back a certain percentage over the original price that it was sold to them for, and then it would slowly decline. So after 5 years, they would be able to keep the total increased value of their property. And that was designed to create this assurances that this particular project would remain housing for teachers, firefighters, and policemen. So I've seen that work in California, and I'm sure that that model would also work in New Hampshire. So my charge here was to provide some information to those who are attending today, some things you could do from your land use regulations to help create more opportunity for housing in your community. And what I've done is focused on basically 5 areas: relaxing rules concerning accessory dwelling units, addressing options for manufactured housing, having a special section for workforce housing in terms of density requirements for housing, modifying subdivision and site plan regulations, and then perhaps also modifying any rules you might have with regards to cluster development zoning regulations. So I'll start with modifying your ADU regulations. Here are some things that would probably require a zoning amendment that you could consider. Number 1, permit detached ADUs. The ADU statute says that ADUs are not permitted, that is, detached ADUs are not permitted unless allowed by a municipality. So that would be one thing you could do as an amendment: permit detached ADUs, which afford more flexibility in your zoning regulations and perhaps would allow more ADUs to be constructed. Second, do not limit ADUs to 750 square feet. The statute allows a municipality to limit ADUs to no more than 750 square feet. Consider allowing larger ADUs, such as 1,000 square feet or 1,200 square feet. Again, of allowing more flexibility in terms of what kind of additional housing can be built at home, places where already have a single family home. Consider eliminating unnecessary parking requirements. You may, if you have a requirement that you have to have 2 additional parking spaces for every ADU, you might be limiting the ability to construct ADUs, and maybe that's really not necessary. I would strongly recommend that your regulations, especially if you're allowing ADUs by special exception, prohibit the use of an ADU for short-term rentals. And then the other thing you could consider is do not require owner occupancy of the principal or accessory dwelling unit. That's something, again, that a municipality can require. So these are just ways, I believe, you could perhaps create greater incentives for the constructions of ADUs in your community. And these, of course, would likely require a zoning amendment. The manufactured housing statute was adopted in the 1980s. I don't remember what year, but it was designed to create more opportunity for manufactured housing. And this is already a form of a statewide zoning mandate. Municipalities are mandated to have one of these 3 methods of permitting the siting of manufactured housing. Why not consider relaxing the rules you may have and permit more of these options rather than what many municipalities have done is simply allow one of the 3 that they're required. So just to be clear, the statute says a municipality that has to allow some form of manufactured housing amongst these 3 options. I'm suggesting perhaps consider more of these options to permit more siting of manufactured housing in your community. Allow manufactured housing to be located on individual lots in most, but not all, land areas zoned for residential purposes. Or, in addition, allow manufactured housing in manufactured housing parks, or, in addition, allow manufactured housing in subdivisions created for the placement of manufactured housing on individual lots in most, but not all, land areas zoned for residential purposes. So you don't just have to limit yourself to one of these options. You could also allow all 3. The next suggestion would be to consider creating a special exception provision that would allow more flexibility for workforce housing, but use the scientifically based dimensional requirements, which are published by the Department of Environmental Services, for when someone is seeking subdivision approval. There is a process whereby someone seeking a subdivision of land over a certain number of lots and land area has to get subdivision approval from the Department of Environmental Services. So DES has published a table telling us, assuming there's no underlying zoning regulation in a town, this table would require a lot size for that subdivision approval to meet these minimum requirements. And I know that in the recently published zoning atlas, this table was certainly turned to as evidence of what is a sufficient lot size for a single family home with on-site septic and on-site well. And I think it's fair to say it generally, if you went this approach with a soil-based table for lot sizes, there will be more areas in your community where you could have more housing because it would increase the density possibility for workforce housing. So think about perhaps using this table, which is available from the DES regulations, as a basis for having a minimum lot size for workforce housing. Again, this would probably require a zoning amendment to adopt such a special exception provision. The third suggestion is to consider modifying your subdivision and site plan regulations. Those regulations may contain certain inherent limitations on the flexibility necessary for an affordable housing developer to construct something at a price point, dwellings at a price point that are truly affordable. One consideration, again, this is done consistent with the public health, safety, and welfare, and probably the input of a civil engineer. Do you really need to have subdivision and site plan roads 24 feet in width of traveled way? And most right-of-ways are 50 feet, and then the traveled way is 24 feet or 30 feet, the amount of bituminous concrete. And the infrastructure, do you really need that much? Can you consider having a less wide or shrinking the size of the traveled way, so it reduces the cost of building that infrastructure. I've understood that the cost for building a single foot of road in today's building and construction market is about $500 a linear foot. So this could add a significant cost savings by shrinking the size of the road reasonably to reduce the cost, the infrastructure cost to the developer for the affordable housing. Along the same lines, perhaps you don't need granite curbing, because granite curbing for streets can be very expensive. Do you really need, for all types of projects that are coming to the planning board, subdivision or site plan, do you really need a full perimeter survey of the entire subject property? Certainly, there are occasions when a property comes to a planning board, it could be a 100-acre parcel, and the initial cost of just doing that full perimeter survey, A, is expensive, and B, because we've seen that there is a certain amount of demand for surveyors right now, it may be very difficult to get a surveyor to do that full perimeter survey. Is that really necessary to safely permit subdivision and site plan approval? Perhaps consider eliminating the need for buffer strips between the subject property and abutting properties. It is fairly common to have municipalities have somewhat demanding buffer strips between, say, a project, say it's a workforce housing project with more smaller lot sizes. The municipality may require a 50 to 100-foot buffer between that project with smaller density and the adjacent properties. That's taking land away from the entire ability to make an overall project affordable if you're setting aside buffer strips, which may or may not be reasonably necessary under the circumstances. Consider eliminating the requirement for underground utilities. I know that in my community, we have that requirement in certain instances. That can be a very expensive proposition for a project to install. Certainly, I understand that underground utilities do protect utilities from adverse weather conditions, which is always of concern, taking into account climate change. Nonetheless, in those circumstances where it's appropriate not to require underground utilities, maybe it's not really necessary. Do you really need to have a second means of egress and ingress from a project? Many towns have a limitation on how many houses can be on a dead-end road or road with a cul-de-sac. Now, I've been told in the past, many of those regulations that limited the maximum length of a road with a cul-de-sac with no second means of egress was based upon the length of the firefighting hoses. So think rationally about whether that's really necessary in your community, and perhaps not require or have such a limited amount of land that can be used with a single road in and to a cul-de-sac, and not require that very expensive second means of ingress and egress. And finally, you may want to consider in certain circumstances, especially where a community, and many of our communities already have a large amount of preserved open space. Maybe it's not necessary to require specific dedication of recreation land for recreation purposes. Next, I want you to consider modifying your cluster development regulations. It may be appropriate to consider how your density calculations are put together. Many towns have cluster development regulations where it sensibly allows the developer to cluster the project over in the dry upland land, and then allow a piece of land that has perhaps a significant area of wetlands to be segregated out as protected wetlands, and then the dry upland area is allowed to be used for development, and sometimes with reduced lot sizes. Think about trying to make sure that density calculation is easy to implement and apply in appropriate circumstances, and maybe relax some of those rules. And maybe even consider, in a conditional use permit approach, allow a cluster development to have a density bonus for workforce housing dwelling units. So those are my quick suggestions for your consideration for improving the opportunity for developing housing in your community. And at this point, I would turn the presentation back over to Noah Hodgetts.
Thank you so much, Steve. So before I go begin with my slides, I'm just seeing two more questions here. First one from Lisa Stone. Didn't the state Supreme Court just rule that short-term housing is an allowed use of all residential housing? I think this is a reference to the Conway decision.
So the Conway decision did not say that. What the Conway decision said was the unique way that Conway had defined the word housing and dwelling unit and household dictated a finding that the manner of that regulation was such that the town had not clearly excluded short-term rentals from residential zoning districts. So that decision is unique just to Conway, and it does not prevent a town from setting forth rules that say short-term rentals are deemed to be transient uses that are only allowed in certain areas where transient uses, transient in terms of dwelling, using it for transient purposes, such as a B&B or a hotel or a motel, those can be segregated into commercial areas of the community. So the Conway decision did not say everyone has to allow short-term rentals in residential areas. That's not the rule of that case. It only is unique to the town of Conway.
Great, thank you. And then there's another question from Andrew Bodnarick about any kind of recommendations about what about impact on municipal services, fire, police, schools, road maintenance. And Sylvia, it looks like you've turned your camera back on, so I don't know if you wanted to respond to that one or the previous question.
She's
Right,
looking
Steve.
for the unmute button. But I can
Yeah.
just say this in terms of the impact on other
Sorry.
parts of the municipal infrastructure. Yes, you clearly have to take into account if there's going to be some growth in the community, how much necessary other infrastructure you have to have. Do you have enough firefighting equipment and firefighting personnel, enough police department equipment and police department personnel, and other elements of the municipal services? But let's be honest, the amount of growth in New Hampshire has been quite minimal over the last 10 years. And I think it's going to be difficult for most communities to argue their infrastructure isn't able to absorb additional dwelling units and residents, because that simply hasn't been what's going on lately. And I think many communities have been very good at maintaining very robust capital improvement plans, putting aside money for capital infrastructure improvements. So my sense is that there are many communities which are ready to absorb more residents through making the ability to build affordable housing more likely with some of these changes that I've suggested.
Sylvia, did you want to add something?
Well, I mean, so these are obviously some things just for our viewers here to consider. There are some that I would debate Steve on, which I already talked about in my presentation, such as the buffer. I think it comes down to a balance between the development, the existing and surrounding, neighborhoods, and how do you get what the developer wants, which is typically density, keep the cost down, but also make sure that it fits in with the existing neighborhood and the character of the community. And that's usually a pretty long discussion. And how do you soften some of that? It's difficult. And I think that like a buffer can soften that. So you had reducing buffer on your list, Steve. But that was, I think, it mostly because you wanted to utilize the land for more density. And to me, they can fit the density on there with a buffer. So I think that's one thing. And what I'm hearing here is I'm seeing a second means of egress helps to build a long-term road network. And that's true too, although often what you'll see is like what I've experienced is if there's a requirement for the road or for a right of way to go to the end of the property or to an abutting property, usually the existing neighborhood wants nothing to do with it. They want a cul-de-sac. They don't want, I've even had a police chief say to me, we love cul-de-sacs. We'll chase a criminal up the road and they have nowhere to go. But, you just have to think about these things. But I like what you're thinking here, the long-term road network, yes, but often there's a fight for that. And that can be difficult. I don't know. What are your thoughts, Steve?
Well, I guess I would just point out that, in those situations where you can truly demonstrate that a second means of egress is required for public health, safety, and welfare, okay, that's fine. And I understand the idea of trying to make sure a new project, residential project, fits into the existing road network. I understand all that. I'm just saying I have seen too often a requirement for a second means of egress based upon not really sound planning. Do you really base it upon the length of the hose that municipality fire departments have? I don't think that's sound. So where it's really not required in order to protect the health, safety, and welfare of the people in that residential development, maybe not requiring a second means of egress or relooking at that regulation is appropriate. Because again, the most expensive part of building a new subdivision is the road. That's a lot of the money goes into that. And if there's a way to do a project saving some of the cost of that infrastructure, but still doing it consistent with public health, safety, and welfare, I think that's something that should be considered. And that can be done by the planning board and its regulations, subdivision and site plan.
And you can actually have both of these happen. You can plan for the road and have it paper right of way, but not build the whole thing. So that's something so that it allows for that road network in the future if it happens. But you maybe not require to build the road out at this point of the development. So I think you can sort of check both boxes there.
Okay, well, in the interest of time, I'm gonna continue. I think there's another question from Molly in here, but we'll come back to that at the end. So now that we've heard some specific strategies and recommendations from Sylvia and Steve, some of them so-called low-hanging fruit, some of them not, I want to take a minute to discuss a few other tools and flexibility in state statute for communities interested in making even more comprehensive zoning and land use regulatory changes to incentivize housing. So first of all, communities that have adopted zoning under RSA 674:16, which is all but 19 communities have adopted, have zoning, also have broad authority under RSA 674:21 to adopt innovative land use controls, which provide more flexibility than traditional Euclidean use-based zoning. There's actually 14 tools enumerated in statute, including transfer of development rights, cluster development, which Steve talked a little bit about, planned unit development. With few exceptions, the statute also provides broad flexibility for communities to adopt other innovative planning techniques not explicitly stated in statute. For example, I know of at least one community in the Upper Valley that's exploring the creation of a pattern zone in which a municipality would provide licensed pre-approved building designs and plans, typically with an expedited permitting process for a specified area and zoning targeted to encourage the production of missing middle housing, really any multi-unit housing scale buildings, anything between really single family and mid-rise or high-rise apartment buildings intended to be part of low-rise residential neighborhoods. This is all to say, really urge you to think creatively, or what are other creative zoning, land use regulatory approaches, planning tools that you can kind of work within your own framework you have in your community to help incentivize more housing production. The other thing I'll say is the one significant exception in the innovative land use control statute 674:21, which I think speaks to a question earlier at the beginning from Christine, is that communities are not allowed to adopt mandatory inclusionary zoning in which they're simply requiring a development or an applicant to include a certain percentage of income restricted housing units in development. A community cannot compel, in other words, a community cannot compel a developer to build affordable income restricted or workforce housing units. Either the developer is going to do it because they're a mission-oriented developer, or as we've discussed, or in combination with, there's enough of an incentive, usually, as Sylvia and Steve mentioned, in the form of some kind of density bonus for them to come to the table and induce them to build. However, that said, communities do have authority under the workforce housing statute. So RSA 674:58 to 61 to create workforce housing overlay districts, which again function kind of as I just explained. For example, those overlay districts might allow multifamily workforce housing at a greater density than the base zoning would otherwise allow, if a certain percentage of units are income restricted, in line with the definitions of workforce housing as laid out in the workforce housing statute. So there are ways of kind of getting at, still working within the confines of voluntary inclusionary zoning while still providing opportunities to require developers to build workforce housing by providing other incentives such as density bonuses. The other tool I wanted to highlight right now is plan unit development. So the graphic on the left of your screen is showing the master plan for Tuscan Village in Salem, which utilized plan unit development, or PUD, which is another non-Euclidean zoning device that redefines land uses allowed within a certain area. They typically integrate a mix of compatible building types, land uses, and densities within a single parcel or across several parcels. And while we think of you probably think of kind of a place like Tuscan Village, or we think of other kind of some of the better known kind of mixed use centers that utilize PUD, like Woodmont Commons in Londonderry, there's a couple of other developments, and one in Portsmouth, that are kind of higher density developments than may be compatible in some rural and suburban communities. There's no reason that a tool like PUD or some other combination of mixed-use zoning couldn't be used to create mixed-use walkable developments, kind of in combination with infill development in our historic village centers and downtowns found in many of our smaller suburban and rural communities throughout the state. And just as kind of a final kind of segue to the next section here, I really like this quote from attorney Brett Allard, who wrote, this was from an article titled "The Past, Present, and Future of Zoning" in the New Hampshire Land Surveys Association newsletter from last summer, in which he said, "We may never nor wish to completely shed Euclidean zoning in our lifetime, given its deep roots in American planning philosophy. But the future appears to be on track for more flexible land planning in order to support and facilitate inevitable population growth and the appetites of modern citizens. And as I've kind of just outlined, with few exceptions, the broad flexibility contained in RSA 674:21, the Innovative Land Use Control Statute, in many respects allows for achieving these ends. So think creatively, as we'll go over a couple of other tools and resources out there, support thinking creatively. And so one other tool for communities that want to go even further than kind of some of the strategies that Steve and Sylvia talked about, some of the tools in the Innovative Land Use Control Statute would be form-based codes, which is essentially taking an entirely different approach to separation of land uses than our traditional zoning, which is use-based or Euclidean zoning, and looking to remedy the fact that many of our buildings and lots, as Sylvia kind of got into a little bit, couldn't be rebuilt under their current zoning schemes. Form-based codes essentially work by regulating land use and development with a focus on character and physical form of an area rather than the use and the buildings, and rather than just separating all land uses. They generally allow for more mixed uses and are a way of especially increasing missing middle housing. The code considers the visual impact of buildings, parking, and the public space, such as sidewalks and streets, and there's also a greater emphasis on character, building features, and the public spaces rather than traditional zoning's emphasis just on how buildings are used. But just to be clear, a form-based code is not a regulation. It's more of a guideline typically adopted into the zoning ordinance. These are just a couple examples of form-based codes, showing it's often divided along a transect from less density to more density. In New Hampshire, we do have a couple of examples of communities that have adopted form-based codes for all or part of their community, including Dover, Keene, Enfield, Lancaster, and Portsmouth. Concord is also working on a draft form-based code to be potentially adopted later this year. So now I'm going to talk about some available tools and resources for communities interested in adopting some of these strategies, whether it's updating their zoning ordinances or making changes to their other land use regulations, including subdivision and site plan regulations, such as some of the strategies Steve highlighted. So here's a list. I'm not going to go through everything right now of resources. The copy of the slides available on our website, which I put a link to at the very beginning of the chat, and maybe Alvina can put a link to again now. We'll also email it to registrants. Includes hyperlinks to each of these resources. Sylvia talked a bit about the regional housing needs assessments in the outset of our presentation. I'll just say that many of them include kind of more detail on different tools in the opportunities and barriers section and recommendations for communities to consider. I'm going to talk a little bit more about the next three in the slides coming up: the HOP grant program, the New Hampshire Housing Toolbox, and the Zoning Atlas. I also want to put a plug-in or a reminder for OPD's Municipal Land Use Regulation Survey. The 2021 data is up on our new website at nhopd.com. We'll have the 2022 data up hopefully sometime middle of this summer. There is also a accompanying interactive map, and that tool is a really good resource for just kind of providing a survey of what tools, planning and zoning tools, different communities are utilizing across the state. Also includes links to each community's zoning ordinance and other land use regulations. Finally, I've included links to a couple of New Hampshire housing publications that are, I think, really helpful when talking about and considering some of these zoning changes around housing. Especially, so the first is Housing Commissions in New Hampshire, about how to set up a local housing commission in your municipality to help kind of think about kind of developing some of these strategies if you're not necessarily ready to go right to town meeting with them. The next one is Policies and Program Models for Creating ADUs in New Hampshire. This actually was just published last week and was a collaboration of Sylvia's RPC, the Southern New Hampshire Planning Commission, and a prior and James Vayo, who used to work for Southern New Hampshire Planning Commission, and also how to talk about housing, really all about, which we're not, unfortunately, don't have time to talk about today, really talks about, you know, given some of the topics, divisive topics we've already talked about or been raised in the Q&A of how do you have a conversation about housing in your community to try to kind of comprehensively address kind of some of these concerns that may come up about impact on school enrollment, fear of other people coming in, you know, so on and so forth. So those are some resources to check out. Now I'm going to delve a little bit deeper into just talking about the HOP grant program and the other Invest in H municipal programs. So first of all, we are still the Invest in H program at BEA is still accepting applications for both the municipal per unit grant program and the municipal demolition grant program. As you know, the municipal per unit grant program is a $30 million program, which provides grants of up to $1 million per project for $10,000 per unit for units that were permitted within 6 months that were applied for after February 17th of 22 of last year, and which will have at least a 5-year affordability component. And as I'll get into in a minute, there's no restrictions on the use of these funds. So there's still that program is still actively accepting applications. but it must, the projects permitted in the municipal per unit grant program have to include at least must result in the production of at least 3 new affordable units. The other program is the municipal demolition grant program. That's a total budget. That program has a total budget of $5 million. And with awards of up to $500,000 per municipality for which is for demolition of dilapidated structures. And this goes to one of the earlier comments that are part of a larger housing revitalization or greening plan, and those funds can be used for demolition and environmental abatement. But I will note that all the permits and certifications must be in place generally prior to the application for demolition funds. So I'm not going to go through this all in detail, but I thought this was a good slide that the Invest folks shared with me about thinking about kind of creative uses of how to use a municipal per unit grant or a municipal demolition grant. So as I said earlier, there's no restriction on how municipal per unit grant funds are used. So in addition to municipalities that were awarded capital, may have had projects that were awarded capital grant funds in their municipality last fall. The Invest NH folks are working or have been working with those awardees and the municipalities in which those projects are located to assist to seeing if those projects may also qualify for municipal per unit funds. And in many cases, the municipality can apply on behalf of the developer as long as they've obtained the affordability agreement to maintain those affordable rent limits for the 5-year affordability period. And again, because there's no limit on how the uses of funds in the per unit grant program are used, it can be used for anything. They could be used in response to one of the earlier questions about impact on infrastructure to support roads, to support parks, to support public infrastructure like water and sewer improvements, increase sewer capacity to kind of be able to add more housing. So there's many different possible uses for those funds. I think Andrew might be commenting in, who's the Invest NH program director and is on this call as well, on other ways to use those funds as well. For the municipal demolition grant program, municipalities can also apply on behalf of developers, offering demolition grant funds to assist in the completion of the new rental units. And projects can applications can either be for complete demolitions or in some circumstances, only just partial interior demolition, converting unusable space into new affordable housing units. So both of those programs, as I said, are still actively accepting applications on a rolling basis. You can find out more information in program guidance for each of those programs and applications at invest603.com. And you can also email questions about either of those programs to investnh@livefree.nh.gov, and the BEA Invest NH team will respond. So next, I want to talk about a little quick refresher on the Invest NH HOP grant program. This is a joint collaboration. So being administered, it's part of the Invest NH program, but being administered by New Hampshire Housing and Plan New Hampshire, as well as with community engagement being led by UNH Cooperative Extension. So some of the highlights: initially, the Invest NH Municipal Planning and Zoning Grant Program was a $5 million grant program for municipalities, and in some cases also RPCs, aimed at increasing housing supply by changing local land use regulations, making zoning changes, doing regulatory audits, all to support, again, incentivized housing production. And again, any of the strategies really that Sylvia and Steve went into detail earlier would be great candidates for Invest HOP grants. So to date, and this number is actually a little low, over $3 million has been awarded to date with five community navigator grants serving 12 different communities. And this says 48 housing opportunity planning grants. I think we just approved 2 or 3 more. So I don't think all the contracts have been signed, but we're definitely over 50 different communities that have received HOP grants at this point. Again, just a fresh refresher, the HOP grant program, in full name being the Housing Opportunity Planning Grant Program. So the phase 1 deadline has passed. That was for needs analysis and planning, but we are still accepting applications for phase 2 grants to do a regulatory audit, as Sylvia highlighted in her slides, to review your zoning ordinances, your other land use regulations, site plan subdivision regulations. So the phase 2 grant applications are due June 30th. Those are for awards up to $50,000. And the phase 3 applications for actual regulatory development, making zoning changes, making other changes to your site plan and subdivision regulations. Those awards are up to $100,000, and those applications, the deadline is not till November 15th, but I will say that I encourage folks to apply sooner rather than later, as there is some funds left, but not a lot at this point. So for more information about either of those programs, you can go to nhopgrants.org or email info@nhopgrants.org. So now I'm going to talk a little bit about the New Hampshire Housing Toolbox, which was a funded by the Regional Housing Needs Assessment Program with the funding from through my office, which came from the American Rescue Plan. So New Hampshire Housing Toolbox is a collection of 20 planning and zoning strategies for housing production in New Hampshire communities. It exists currently, it's available as a PDF. You'll see this is a direct link. You can also find it if you go to nhhousingtoolbox.org. And sometime probably next month, there's also going to be a companion interactive format online as well. We don't have time, obviously, to go through every tool right now, but as you can see, so the toolbox covers 20 different tools, everything from recommendations around ADUs like Steve and Sylvia spoke to some of the tools I talked about form-based codes, to missing middle housing, transfer of development rights, newer things like the expansion of 79E to include housing opportunity zones. So there's a chapter about each of these tools. And so the toolbox tries to answer for each of these tools. What is the tool? How can it help your community? How has it been used elsewhere? What does implementation look like? And where you can learn more. And it's both the PDF and really the interactive format. The tools are sorted by different issues. So you can sort by housing options, housing costs, affordable housing, sustainable green housing, multi-generational housing, infrastructure, and redevelopment. And finally, each tool in the toolbox in the PDF, which I said is available now, and on the website next month. Each tool is structured as there's a kind of what is it, how can it help, getting started, and there's the considerations, and it goes into different resources that you can use to kind of implement that tool. Issues addressed, related tools, kind of a link to where, if there's any overlap with state statute or any kind of restriction based in state statute, and then a series of case studies. So I hope that tool is going to be really helpful. I also did just want to very briefly mention the New Hampshire Zoning Atlas, which probably many of you are maybe aware of at this point. This is a joint collaboration led by the St. Anselm College Center for Ethics and Society in collaboration with New Hampshire Housing and BEA and my office, OPD. The New Hampshire Zoning Atlas is a collaborative project, a 16-month project to research, catalog, and digitize and graphically display New Hampshire's housing-related zoning regulations, community by community, district by district. The Atlas, though, is a policy-neutral tool, so it's really just another tool in the toolbox, another resource for folks to consider. And it's really great, I think, for this audience and kind of comparing community by community. Okay, we know something's working well why is Dover, why is one town, maybe say Dover, we've seen had a lot of housing unit production or something. Well, you can now go and view and go look at Dover's or any community zoning district, district by district, and really pull up the regulations. Click on a district, put in a location, and pull up all the dimensional requirements and all the kind of everything from what's a type of housing allowed, so forth, to kind of figure out kind of examples of what other communities are doing. As part of the project, the Zoning Atlas project collected over 23,000 pages of zoning, subdivision, and site plan review ordinances, as well as zoning ordinances, zoning maps, as well as June 1st, 2020. For communities that only had paper maps, they were all digitized. So currently they found there's 269 jurisdictions in the state that have zoning, and they found 2,139 zoning districts. As I said, all the information in the atlas is categorized for different housing treatments, talks about what communities have affordable or workforce housing overlays for each zoning district, so on and so forth, and then details on different dimensional regulations, minimum lot size, setback requirements, lot coverage, height restrictions, as well as parking requirements. Something like 100 different variables. I'm sorry, more like 200 different variables for each zoning district, something like 400,000 data variables. Here's just a snippet of what the viewer looks like. If you click on this slide, the link to the viewer should be embedded in that slide for you to kind of poke around with. Last thing I'll say in the Zoning Atlas is that it's not a perfect tool. They were utilizing a methodology based on the Connecticut Zoning Atlas. It's then being now created or used to create a national zoning atlas. Some things may look funny or may not totally reflect. You might, especially for the town and community planners on the call, some differences. And there's certainly some nuance that isn't captured in the atlas. There's also probably some kind of some inaccuracies, and it's 400,000 data points. There was several QA, QC checks, but there's bound to be some inaccuracies. I encourage all of you, as you explore the Atlas, to submit corrections to Zoning Atlas, the email on this, zoningatlas@anselm.edu. And the full Atlas, like I said, and additional information about the findings can be found at nhzoningatlas.org. So before we get to before we get to the end, I just want to offer some kind of final concluding thoughts here of things to kind of keep in mind. So Steve and Sylvia, I think, did a great job of offering some great suggestions on how to improve zoning to make housing work in your community. And I've obviously offered some other available resources. But now the question is, okay, how do you actually translate those ideas into success? So here in that light, here are some just kind of a few thoughts to kind of consider. First of all, it's never too early to start examining roadblocks in your existing zoning ordinance, researching zoning changes, and drafting zoning amendment language. The summer, so right now coming up, is often a great time to start in advance of annual town meeting for the vast majority of communities where zoning changes have to be passed at town meeting. As Sylvia said in the beginning, talked about kind of the importance of master plan updates. Ensure zoning changes align with and are supported by the master plan, especially the vision, land use, and housing chapters. And I completely agree with Sylvia. Also, other chapters like transportation, economic development. The stronger the synergy there, the better. I'll also say there's no such thing as too much community engagement. Think creatively about how to engage stakeholders and voters in the process beyond traditional means such as surveys and community forums. We've gotten with the HOP grant program, and I didn't have time to talk about Housing Academy and the comprehensive community engagement training that UNH Cooperative Extension is leading for all the HOP grantees, really kind of exposing communities to all different alternative community engagement techniques, everything from focus groups, stakeholder interviews, going to where there's other meetings already happening, going to your local VFW post or Rotary Club where there's already going to be a vested group of people, thinking out of the box on community engagement. And I'm sure I know Sarah Reitzman and I don't know if George is on here, could probably chime in the chat with a lot more other strategies for innovative community engagement strategies. One or two other thoughts. Ground truth proposed zoning changes with developers to know whether the proposed incentives, and this goes back to an earlier question about how do you actually get developers to come to the table to build workforce housing. Ground truth them, ground truth any of those kind of proposed changes with developers before they're passed, when you're still in the kind of exploration stage, drafting change, to know whether those incentives, those density bonuses, those changes in relaxation and dimensional requirements, the streamlining of the process is actually likely to result in a project penciling out and inducing a developer to actually use that zoning and come to the table and actually build more housing. And the last one on this slide is be realistic about what types of zoning changes and planning tools to accommodate additional housing your land use administrator and town planner and planning board actually has capacity to administer on an ongoing basis. There's a ton of great tools out here that we've highlighted. They're not all going to work for all communities of all shapes and sizes. I'd love to share Dover and how great Dover's transfer of development rights program is. And, they've the cottages at Back Rivers Road, the 44 affordable cottages that the Randolphs are doing that have resulted their TDR program is great. But that's an example of a program that actually it requires a lot of some level of administrative oversight and handholding. That's could be is going to be more difficult for smaller communities that don't have capacity. So be realistic. I'm not saying think creatively, but also think about what you actually, especially smaller communities, what you actually have capacity to administer. And then just 3 or 4 final thoughts, and then should have about 10 minutes left for Q&A here. When aligning the higher density zoning with areas that have access to water and sewer and have excess sewer capacity, make sure that there are other sections of your zoning ordinance or land use regulations, as Steve talked about a bit in his kind of streamlining and kind of providing more flexibility in the subdivision and site plan regulations. Make sure there's not other unintentional barriers in your ordinance that are creating these kind of stumbling blocks that aren't allowing for higher density zoning in your areas where you want to kind of where there's opportunity with water and sewer. Make sure there aren't, do the regulatory audit to make sure these stumbling blocks are not creating, not kind of limiting the use of the higher density zoning. And a couple things, and this leads into my next thought here. When drafting zoning changes, again, ensure the zoning changes don't conflict with other sections of the zoning ordinance and land use regulations. I cannot tell you how many times I've reviewed a zoning change that passed a town meeting only to find that there's a direct conflict or the impact of that zoning change is kind of greatly reduced as a result of some other requirement in either the subdivision regulations or a different section of the zoning ordinance. So I encourage you to do your homework on that one. And the last 3 are about kind of making that final push at town meeting. Say, don't underestimate the community engagement and education needed to get zoning amendments passed by ballot at town meeting. Be prepared for a last minute campaign against proposed zoning changes, which explodes on social media, and have a plan to counteract that ahead of time. I wish that wasn't the case, but we've just seen this time and time again, where you think you have momentum and then something explodes on Facebook at the 11th hour, and the zoning amendment is defeated after a year and a half of really hard, really great work. My last one here is just keep the zoning amendment language on the official ballot to be voted on at town meeting simple, and prepare a summary guide for voters explaining zoning changes in plain English. Just remember, we're all deep in the weeds. A lot of us on this call are deep in the weeds on this. A lot of the voters, when you think about a town meeting, don't have all the context and prior background that we have. So I know I threw a lot at you. We do have a little bit of time left for questions. I think we scheduled this till 1:30. I want to be respectful of people's time. I think there's been a bit of a Q&A back and forth, give and take. So I'm going to try to catch up here. Sylvia and Steve, I invite you back here to turn your cameras back on here. And I'd invite additional questions. I was trying to see where we left off on questions here.
I'm going to just, while people are thinking of questions, I look like I'm weirded with my Wi-Fi. Am I okay?
Yep.
Okay, good. So Noah, you brought up really inviting the developer to the table to verify, that the zoning works. So I'm going to piggyback on that by saying it's, if you see the developer as the enemy, it's not a good way to start. And if you see the developer as someone you need to work with and invite him to the table or her to the table to discuss the challenges and how you want, how you want the community to grow, I think they'll be much more open to working with you. And so, we did that on a couple of occasions with different communities, and it was really beneficial. So I highly encourage that.
Great. Thank you. So there was, I know Molly had a question. There was some back and forth about design review and whether design reviews good option to discuss to discuss concepts.
Yeah, I think I saw Bart over in
Yeah.
Newmarket. Hi, Bart. He brought that up, and I think that was a good, whether it's called design review or conceptual review.
Yeah.
I know there are differences there. I think what he was basically saying is invite the development team to come in early and talk about the development with the planning board so that there can be input. And I think that was a great, whether, I don't want to get caught up in semantics, whether it's conceptual review or design review. It is true if you go to design review, it can require a butter notification. It can require a lot more. So I think where he was going was just get someone in early when it's just between the developer and the planning board.
Great. Sorry, I'm just making my way through all these questions. There's more back and forth on design review.
There's a question here about administering workforce housing requirements and,
Okay.
and creating affordability controls.
Yep.
I believe Exeter has developed a mechanism for doing that for some of their density bonuses they've granted for workforce housing, but I can't guarantee that that's true. But I would certainly, if you were interested in trying to develop administrative procedures for ensuring a future affordability of an approved workforce housing project, I would consider reaching out to the town of Exeter.
Great. And I'll put in here too.
We did that back in 2000, 2001, when the planning board realized that the housing that was being built was unaffordable to their own adult children wanting to stay in town. And that's where that all began back in 2000, 2001 with that planning board. And we worked at the time actually with Eric Chinberg and also with Cliff Sennett, who was the Rockingham Planning Commission director at the time.
Great.
On drafting those regulations.
Right. And I will say, I also put in the chat, New Hampshire Housing did a review of the workforce housing law. I think it came out last year. They did case studies on different workforce housing ordinances throughout the state, what's working, what's not. I think there may be some stuff in there that addresses some of this kind of affordability controls and actual administration. Sarah Wrightsman, who I know is putting stuff in the chat, can probably correct me if I'm wrong, but that may also be a good resource. Other questions? We have a couple minutes left. And I'll also mention, all right, we'll also mention that the Invest team at BEA, so my colleagues on the call, Andrew Dorsett, the head of the Invest NH Finance, or Invest NH Finance Director, and Justin Rosa Mazzilio, who's also on the Invest team. So they've created kind of an affordable housing covenant for the capital grant programs and for the municipal per unit grant programs that I think will also really be helpful and kind of, we can squibble about whether 5 years is enough or not, but I think will be really helpful in terms of also to get at that question of actual administering affordability and guaranteeing the kind of affordability of the units over time. We have a comment from Stephanie about egress. I think we're back to the question about second egress.
Yeah, I think she makes another valid point. There's been a lot of good discussion about this, but her point is, look, and with intense weather changes and increasing frequency, it's good to have that second egress, which, yeah, that could be pretty valid.
Yeah. Yeah. So I'm not seeing, I'll give folks one more chance to kind of put questions back in.
Well,
but I do want to try to be I do want to be respectful of people's time. So somebody's asking where to find the slide deck. So I'll let Alvina put it in the chat one more time. If we didn't get to your question in the chat, I think we did, but if you have follow-up questions, feel free to reach out to any of the three of us via email. And then we'd also appreciate if you fill out the anonymous online survey to gather feedback for our future webinars. I also just want folks to be on the lookout for an email in the next week. We're going to be doing additional trainings about the New Hampshire Housing Toolbox and specific tools in the toolbox with our consultant out with Studio to dig more into the details on cluster and open space zoning, transfer of development rights, 79E, and form-based codes. Those are going to be on each Thursday in June from 12 to 1. So June 1st, June 8th, June 15th, June 22nd, and June 29th. Just encourage folks to save those dates. We'll hopefully have the email out about that with additional information to register for each of those sessions out in the next few weeks. Other than that, thank you so much. Have a great afternoon.